Hey everyone, and welcome to another video by artandcontext.org where we explore various art related topics. My name is Matt, and in today's tutorial we will be learning how to paint a sunflower with watercolor paint. Now, the subject matter of flowers does really well with watercolor, and this is because the watercolor medium does really well to create these layers. Due to the water soluble nature of watercolor, we can create these very interesting overlapping qualities within our watercolor paint mark making process. Now, this is extremely useful when you want to paint something like a flower, because most often flowers petals, or the petals surrounding the disc floret, which is the center part of a flower, have these overlapping qualities, and this is because the petals have layers to them. The watercolor medium does really well to create these unique and nuanced painterly like marks that establish these layers within the petals, and in the case of this sunflower painting, that's exactly what we're going to do. So the way in which we want to start is we're going to start with a simple pencil sketch where we establish a circle in our page, and this is going to establish the disc floret, or the center of the flower. From there, what we want to do is we want to make sure we have some water nearby as well as our paint, and this is where we're going to start loading our brushes with some yellow paint. So the idea here is to not necessarily worry too much about making a perfect yellow. Every time we reload our brushes, as we will see within this tutorial, we'll create layers. We can allow the yellow to change slightly, we can add little tints of orange as well, and this is just going to give our sunflower a little bit more of a nuanced look, a little bit more of an interesting color variation and tonal value within our flower painting. Now, when we're working with something like a watercolor medium, it's really important to consider the type of brushes you use. So in the case of this particular tutorial, a good suggestion would be to use something like a round brush. This is where the brush is quite thick near the base and becomes more narrow near the tip. The reason why we do this is because as we load our brushes with some paint, what we're going to do is we're going to make these strokes where we press very slightly and then harder to thicken each of the petals in our sunflower painting, and then slowly lessen our pressure on our brush, and then ultimately making those petals slightly thin again. So there's this moment of like light pressing, hard pressing, and then becoming light again in each single petal. And this is going to create that very unique arrowhead shape that is synonymous with the aesthetic of sunflower petals. What we want to do is, working with our yellow paint as well as our water, we want to continue this process of dipping our brush in some water, loading our brushes with some paint, and making these layers of arrowhead shaped petals that move around that circle. What we want to do is we want to not necessarily overlap them just yet, as these are going to establish the petals that sit in the background of our sunflower painting. Now we can continue this process until we have gone around the entire circle of the disc floret, and that is the center of the sunflower. Now the idea here is to also keep these marks the same length. So again, the idea here when we are pressing is that we are lightly pressing, and this way we can get that more narrow quality connecting to the disc floret, or the circle in the center of our sunflower, and then we can press slightly harder to create a larger middle surface area within our petals, within each petals, and then kind of soften our pressure again on our brush to bring those petals to a narrow point. So it should be one swift stroke of kind of starting soft, pressing hard, and then lightening the pressure to become more narrow at the tip of each of the petals. Now this process you can continue until you have gone around the entire circle or disc floret. And now the idea is that what we're going to do is we're going to start this again and proceed to add in more of these petal shapes, but in between the first layer of petals that we have just painted. Something important to note though before we proceed with this process is we just want to make sure that that first layer is dry. Once that first layer is dry, then we can proceed to add the next layer of petals into our sunflower painting. Now the idea is that we're going to proceed with this process again, however this time when we reload our brushes with some paint, we're going to slightly darken our yellow paints with a little bit of orange. Now the reason why we do this is because as we paint this next layer of petals around our disc floret, and over the previous layer of petals, we're going to create this overlapping quality where we see the previous layer slightly visible through this next layer that we paint on top of, and this is going to create this quality of depth and three-dimensionality three-dimensionality, and it also gives a very unique aesthetic, painterly aesthetic to our sunflower painting, which is very unique to the watercolor medium. Now again, we're going to proceed with the same process of adding in these arrowhead shaped petals and making sure that we work around the entire disc floret. However, we do want to make sure that as we paint in this next layer of petals, what we want to make sure is that we are painting them in between the petals from our previous layer. Now in doing so, that previous layer is going to be slightly visible, as well as the new layer of petals, and this is just going to enhance the three-dimensional quality of our painting, as well as give it a little bit more depth and tonal variation within our petals. Now this process we can again proceed to do until we have worked our way around the entire disc floret, making sure that we have these narrow edges at the end of each of our petals. Again, you can slightly darken this new layer of petals. When it comes to sunflowers, they're not necessarily this perfect type of yellow. There are always color variations and tonal variations and fluctuations that shift between darker and lighter yellows and oranges. So adding in a little bit of orange to create a sense of depth and tonal variation within your sunflower painting is only going to enhance its overall quality. Now once we have done that, again we're going to allow that to dry, and then we're going to proceed with one last layer, and this is where we can one more time darken our yellow paint, mix with a little bit more orange, and then we can start working in another layer of petals. With this third layer of petals, you don't necessarily need to fill the entire or go around the entire disc floret again. You can be a little bit more sparing with this third layer, maybe feeling like you just want to fill any sort of gaps in between petals that might seem a little bit irregular or uneven. So this third layer of petals is more just a matter of filling up any spaces in between petals, should you feel that it needs it. Now what we're going to proceed to do is create the disc floret, and this is the very iconic black disc floret in the center of the sunflower. However, we're going to do this in a very watercolor specific type way, where we actually fill the entire disc floret, or that circle feature, with a light coating of water. Now what we want to do is we want to make sure that we fill that entire disc floret or circle center area with a light coating of water. And then what we're going to do is we're going to work simultaneously with both blacks and browns, where we're going to start to create these little dabs of paint in that circle area. Now the idea is that again we're going to start with some layers where we work paint into this feature while that little surface area is completely wet. And in doing so, we're going to see that the paint is going to seamlessly integrate and merge into one another, and this is going to establish a base layer, which we will then let dry. So make sure that you first coat that entire circle section with a thin layer of water, making sure that is evenly spread out within that circle section, and then you can start to actually dab and make little dots of black and brown paint in that circle area, and allowing these two colors to merge into one another, which is going to establish this dark base layer in the center of our sunflower. Now we're going to work a little bit swiftly now. We want to be quite quick. The idea now is to kind of work with some tissue paper whilst that section is still damp, while the paint is still damp. And what we're going to do is we're going to start actually poking that section with some tissue paper and pulling paint off of the paper with our tissue paper. Now the reason why we do this is we're going to create these little negative spaces within the disc floret, which are going to function as highlights, and then we're going to allow that to dry and then slowly work in some darker painterly marks around that once it's dried, to create this again quality of depth and three-dimensionality. The reason why we always want to work quite strategically with negative spaces is always to create a quality of highlight. So when we work with watercolor paints, you always want to consider how to achieve highlights in a really effective way, and often the best way to do this is to kind of work with negative spaces. So when you create a painterly mark and it's still wet, a really effective way to create these moments of highlights or negative spaces is to kind of take paint off the paper by dabbing it with like tissue paper or toilet paper or any sort of material that can absorb wet paint a little bit. In doing so with the disc florets, what we're gonna have left over are these moments, these little white dots, which will kind of give the disc florets a little bit more depth and texture once we have added some black painterly marks around it. Now this is where we're going to become a little bit more strategic with our painterly marks, and this is where we can kind of approach this section with a more drawing style format. Now we only want to do this once the first layer is dry, and once it has dried we're going to start using a smaller brush, and in doing so we're going to work with browns and blacks, where we start to create these little stippling marks to create the pollen buds or the effect of pollen buds in the center of our sunflower. And this is again where we want to consider depth and we want to consider highlights in order to create a more three-dimensional structure within the center of that flower. So for instance, as we work in these little dots, we want to kind of focus more on the surrounding area or the outer ring area within the disc floret, and then leave a little bit of negative space and then add some more spots in the center of the disc floret. So the idea here is to consider leaving some negative spaces or some lighter spaces from the previous layer, and in doing so we're going to create this quality of three-dimensionality within that textural area of our sunflower painting. What you want to do is, again, you want to think about how the disc floret isn't necessarily a flat surface, but it does have these little buds that protrude outwardly, and also it has more of a dome-like shape. However, the center of the disc floret tends to be a little bit more sunken in, so it kind of has this more crevice or volcano type of structure in the center, where it sticks out and then concaves inward again near the center. The way in which we want to represent this is to leave a little bit of a lighter ring between the outer section where we add dots, and then leave this little light ring, and then we can darken the center again. And this is just a way to create that quality of depth within our sunflower painting. Now make sure you take your time with this. Again, this is where we approach the sunflower painting with a little bit more of a drawing format, where we actually load our smaller brush with some black and brown paint, as if we were loading our brushes like a ink pen, and then we can proceed to make these stippling marks to create that quality within our sunflower painting. Now once we have completed that, we should let that dry, and then we can start moving on to adding in some of. Now this time again we're going to clean our brushes and reload our brushes with some green paint. However, this time what we want to do is we want to add little hints of black and brown into our green paint to give it a little bit more of a neutral and natural color palette. Now when we paint in leaves, what we want to do is we want to think about the structure of the sunflower and how large these leaves are in relation to the sunflower as a whole. And sunflower leaves tend to be quite large, and they also stick out from the base of the sunflower where it connects to the stem. So as we paint in these leaves, we're going to be quite cautious about starting them from behind the petals. So that means that we're going to start painting these leaves starting from the edges of the petals, but we want to make sure we work around the edging of the petals to create this idea that the leaves are protruding or becoming visible from behind the sunflower. Now sunflowers are quite large, however their leaves are also quite large, so they tend to kind of become more visible from behind the sunflower. What we're going to do is we're going to proceed to now work in a few different leaves around our sunflower painting, and this is where we make sure we start from the edges of our very dried up petals. Again, we don't want to make sure we're painting it while the petals are still wet. That way we make sure we don't make a mistake by letting the green paint merge into the yellow paint. So once the sunflower is completely dry, we can start to work in these leaves. Now we can work these leaves in from various directions from behind the sunflower. However, something to consider is that the leaf shape is quite an arrowhead shape, so we can play around with size and scale. We can also create leaves that droop downwardly. However, what we do want to do is we want to work with a large brush, a large round brush. Again, this is where we can seamlessly create that quality of an arrowhead shape where we press hard to create a larger surface area and then lighten our pressure to bring that leaf shape to a more narrow point. Now we're going to do this for various leaves, but what we do want to do is we actually want to work quite quickly within our leaves, and this way what we can do with our smaller brush is while the paint of our leaves is still wet, we can actually pull paint outwardly from the edges of the leaf in these small narrow strokes, and in doing so we can create these little spiky edges around the leaf to give it a little bit more texture and detail. And this is just going to give the leaf a little bit more of a realistic quality within our sunflower painting, giving it a little bit more three-dimensionality, a little bit more of a naturalistic look, as opposed to being this flat arrowhead shape. What we can do once our leaves have dried up is we can also start painting in the stem, which can flow downwardly from beneath the sunflower. So that stem can be more of a simple vertical stroke with our paintbrush, and then we can create another little stroke from the stem that suggests it's flowing into one of the leaves. You can play around with your leaves. You can also allow the leaves to dry completely, and in doing so you can then darken your leaves with another layer of green. You can leave some leaves lighter, and you can also, whilst your leaves are still wet, you can actually lift paint from the leaf with your paintbrush, a dry paintbrush, and that's another way to kind of create these negative spaces within your painterly marks without necessarily having to use tissue paper. In doing so, when you use a dry brush to create these negative spaces, you can also create more accurate line work, and this is really good for creating marks within a leaf or trying to create that quality of highlights within a three-dimensional structure. But otherwise, guys, that is the general process of how to paint a sunflower. Again, there are many ways to paint sunflowers or flowers in general. However, when you're working with something like a watercolor medium, it's really fun and interesting to understand the capacity and the potential of the medium. So working with these layering effects and allowing things to dry and then working new layers on top of it is also just a unique way to paint a sunflower and ultimately give it that very unique watercolor aesthetic. I hope this tutorial was helpful and informative. Some key things to remember: if you want to create negative spaces within your painterly marks, you have to work quite fast, and that's where you can lift up the paint while it's still wet with maybe a tool like a dry brush or some tissue paper. And then the other thing is allowing the paint to completely dry and then working over some more dry painterly marks where you can kind of approach or layer onto your painting with more of a drawing style painterly format. And this is where you can make more fine lines and make a little bit more finer details on top of that painterly layer. And then lastly, making sure that you allow layers to dry is also really important. It's important to note that a watercolor medium is a water soluble medium, so that means if layers are still wet, they will be affected, and this can be a strategic way to create marks, but it can also be a way to accidentally mess up your painting. But otherwise, guys, that's it from me. I hope this video was informative and helpful. If you are interested in other watercolor topics or related topics, please let us know in the comment section below. We'd love to make more videos on this subject matter and this specific medium. And if you are interested in art related content in general, please give us a like and a subscribe. This helps to grow the channel, it supports us, and obviously enables us to make more videos on this type of content. Otherwise, guys, thanks again. That's it from me. Until next time, cheers.